Former gang members. What made you want to leave? Please comment your stories. Now let's find out. Story 1. Personally, I ended up getting out because I realized the pattern I was falling into. Before I even turned 18, I had 6 charges on my record, 2 of them felonies, and I was on third strike, which basically means if I commit another violent crime I can be locked away for life automatically, and any non-violent crime, no matter how small it is, can be an automatic 7 years if they choose. As of right now, since my charges were all between the ages of 13 to 16, I've been told if I don't get in trouble for the next 10 years after my last charge, 2013, I can get my records expunged, so that's what I'm aiming for at the moment. But it's crazy knowing any little thing can send me back for such a long time because of how stupid I was as a teen. A lot of my friends never got the chance to get out. One of my friends is doing 12 years. He's been in there since he was 17. And another one is doing life, so I'm just glad I got out before that happened, but I still have to be careful. Story 2. Used to have a very serious drug problem. Coupled with the fact I grew up in a rough hood, it was inevitable. Basically, I needed protection and drugs. But like most people here are pointing out, eventually you just get too old for that crap. Kicked my drug habit several years ago, found an amazing girl, and realized I didn't have to stay in such a dangerous spot. We moved out to the mountains, and aside from my police record and my ongoing struggle with addiction, I left those demons back in the city. For real though, you can leave your hood so easily if you want to. Took me so long to realize that. Story 3. Going to try to keep it as short and to the point as possible, while giving context to understand how it all started. Basically, story of a good grades kid turning into a gangbanger. Rough neighborhood, Northern California, Hispanic. Norteños, Northerners red, insult name Busters, versus Serenos, Southerners blue, insult name, scrap/sewer rats. My family was Norte. Our number is 14, because N is 14th letter in the alphabet, Nuestra Familia. Sirs use 13 for M, Mexican Mafia. Backstory. Good grades, advanced classes in elementary, pre-AP and AP, advanced placement, classes in middle school/high school. Took care of grandparents, didn't have much but I was grateful. Learned how important $100 can be for groceries or bills early on. Joined Norte after I tried taking the bus to my first year of HS when some sirs jumped me, and then continued to rob me at the bus stop for a week straight, every morning and afternoon when I got home. Got tired of it. My uncles drove up with some sawed-offs and an old TC9. We don't all have AKs. They ran off and I had no troubles after, felt badass, like a man for once, like I actually had control. Grandparents got sick during my middle school years, and by my freshman year I was cooking dinner, cleaning, buying groceries, etc. Started selling drags and leftover pain medication my grandparents didn't use. Grandpa was born in the 40s and worked in a steel mill for decades. Seen him get bit by snakes and dogs and not even flinch, so his Vicodin and Oxy literally piled up cause he wanted to look tough by not taking, to not make me think he was really sick and dying. I was the only person the AP kids could go to for weed since all my homies scared them. They only saw me as a decent person because I had classes with them and would occasionally make jokes and just be pleasant to be around. So they saw me differently, plus the athletes only got tested for weed, so they bought plenty of pills off me. Got in lots of gang fights, couple of robberies, when no one was home, not like GTA liquor store stuff, and occasionally had to pull my grandpa's .357 out when people came around my house trying to jump me. Thankfully never got into actual gun fights. I did 2 drive-by with some older homies, but it wasn't like the movies. Just drove past the house and unloaded into the windows to send a message. Had a good handful of my childhood friends die, one from stabbing and bleeding out on the way to hospital, because no one would call 911 when gang shit pops off, even if it's a teen, 2 that OD'd, 1 end of life, 3 from gunshots, and my best friend was run over. Grandparents died into my junior year, had to move to AZ with family, about as far down south as you could get compared to NorCal. Thought I was going to get jumped by a bunch of scraps my first day of school there. No one did anything. Everyone was interested in the new kid from Cali. Obviously looked like a gangbanger, dressed like one, so I was instantly cool. Plus I had some advanced classes, so the teachers and students wanted me to introduce myself and talk about where I was from. Just like my old AP friends in Cali, they were surprised that I was a decent person, made lots of friends. Finished HS and graduated, and am now working in insurance claims for a credit card company while taking community college classes. The biggest realization came when I talked about my gang affiliations, and no one in AZ knew WTF I was talking about. One cute girl in the group I was hanging out in said, "So it's basically like LA gangsters, except you wear red and tag 14. Oh, and you don't wear your flannels with only the top button buttoned." Really showed me how stupid gang banging was when Norte and Sirs are the same exact thing, with very minor differences. I still have lots of family and friends who gang bang, and the only time I talk to friends from my hometown are when another old friend dies, and they call me to let me know. Don't gang bang, go to school or work. There's enough people dying in the world already. Story 4. Got older and seemed stupid. Felt stupid representing a group of 7th grade dropouts. I wanted to represent myself. The ones that aren't dead or in prison still live with their parents, and all they have going for them in life is that red bandana. Story 5. Brazilian here. I was a teenager in the mid-2000s. Used to hang with a lot of other kids who were also low middle class and had a lot of time and liberty to be on the streets causing havoc. A lot of them were hooligans. In Brazil, hooligans are really common in major cities with big football teams, but it's somewhat different from those in Europe. People hang in the torcidas organizadas, wear uniforms, sometimes carry guns and fight over petty shit with people from other torcidas. The main goal is to beat and steal the other crew's materials like shirts, hats, flags, and this kind of stuff. It's not uncommon to see people die over this ridiculous nonsense. Anyway, it was a large gang, but no one did heavy stuff like killing people, even though sometimes someone was packing a revolver or a pistol. At least I never heard of something like that. We used to beat the crap out of other people from other hoods, though. Some of us were really violent. A lot of my friends trained martial arts just for the sake of kicking people's ass on the street. I stopped hanging around because some of my friends got arrested for attempted murder, and they just didn't give a single fuck even after jail. Some of them also sold weed, and I'd begun to wake up to the fact that crap was getting more serious. I had a lot of doubts before, after seeing people get wrecked over nothing. Like, random street fights were common. I saw a couple of random dudes getting their heads stepped on, noses exploded, teeth broken, people threatening others with fire weapons. I chose to focus on school, and years later I'm a lawyer with no criminal background, thankfully. My friends from that time are doing okay, I guess. They are alive, and I think that's a good thing, considering what they used to do and how many enemies they made. I'm sorry if I made any grammar mistakes, in Brazilian and rarely write in English. Story 6. I wouldn't necessarily call it a gang, but basically I used to hang out with a bunch of criminals, burglars, drug dealers. They even pulled some extortion on people I knew. I was this skinny 18-years-old nerd just there to smoke some weed while these people would sometimes walk in with stolen TVs, pounds of weed and stuff. I met them through a mutual friend I knew growing up. He dropped out of high school and never did anything to improve while I had started a career. I was a college dropout. By the time I started my job, I just ghosted him and basically everyone else I knew. At that point, I had only been hanging out with people I smoked with, which was like 2 to 3 people, completely, and don't see any of them anymore. We all live in the same borough, so we sometimes cross paths, but they don't really say much. I never got in any fights, but I was in a constant position where if we got pulled over by the cops, I would have ruined my life. At one point I had such terrible anxiety, when driving my legs would shake uncontrollably. My entire body was shivering in the middle of July. Getting a phone call would trigger my anxiety, as it probably meant we were going somewhere. I still deal with anxiety today, and also some pretty bad overall depression. Story 7. In junior high, I used to hang out with DS. I grew up with them. When they were juniors, I dated a few, partied with them, hung out and played kick the can, etc. We weren't full-fledged teens yet, so we just got to be silly kids. Fast forward 2 years, 15-ish, and they had to get jumped in, sell coke, carry straps, protect the block, and I stopped hanging out with them. 2 or 3 of them would still come to my house to hang out, and I could tell they weren't fond of their new expectations. They would call the cops on their own gang activity, so they could take a day off and claim it's too hot. When I brought over my new high school friends, and they all met they fit in fine, they could have been regular kids. But the pressure became apparent when we would make plans, and they couldn't come with the beach, pools, Six Flags, etc. There were days that the whole gang went, and that was out of protection. They did go out with us once in a while, and to me it was so normal. They were just a little older, but still the same goofy kids I grew up with. They didn't gang bang around us. They didn't challenge anyone's affiliations. They didn't charge us for the weed. They could have been regular teens. Fast forward 2 more years, and the full-fledged boys in blue and black had dropped out, started hanging out with older gang members and proving themselves. I had already stopped talking to them, but heard from the grapevine that one was hurt badly, 2, in jail for attempted murder, and 3, running from a warrant for an armed robbery. They became the stereotype, misogynistic, ignorant, rude, crimey, dudes you ignore like bums. All because older dudes took advantage of them and their willingness to prove themselves. They were decent kids at first. They didn't leave, the gang left them. Story 8. My mom used to run with a gang in one of the larger suburbs of Chicago when she was very young, 15/16. She said that one of the last things that she did with these people was steal guns from her friend's dad, and then at gunpoint in a van they were in, she got a gun put to her head and told she was going to rob a convenience store. She did. My grandmother found out and put my mother in a mental hospital for her protection, and then placed in witness protection of sorts. Moved downstate, and she hasn't really been back. It's a time that my mom really doesn't talk about too much, but when she does it carries extra weight. Story 9. I used to be a big brother in a certain chivalrous organization. There were a combination of factors for my departure. Chief among them was that I had a serious problem with the newer generations and how they perceived power, and quite frankly, I grew tired. Of those that joined our ranks who were from the newer generations, they did not understand basic concepts of honor, respect, or dignity, which added pressure to an increasingly volatile territorial issue that we were facing. They didn't seem to understand that violence was only meant to be a tool, not just the way we handled every interaction with everybody that we encountered. We filled a niche that law enforcement weren't traditionally able to accommodate, but there was obviously a darker side to our work, and some people were neither mentally nor psychologically capable of handling the dual nature of our existence in society. There was what I'd consider a huge war that erupted a few decades ago when one of the bosses of a large chivalrous organization had passed away naturally of a heart attack. This left a power vacuum that wasn't meant to stay empty because of the ambitions of several men who felt that it was their right to step up and fill that absence. Long story short, there were many of us who were killed and seriously injured. I was shot several times during all of this, but managed to survive. At this point, I decided that I had had enough. I had been learning English, Russian, and German, working on becoming fluent in those languages, which was very difficult. During the chaos of the fallout of what had happened, I grabbed my rainy day fund and fled the country to live abroad. Since then, I have lived simply, without the ostentatious displays of wealth and power that I had been accustomed to. I hated every minute of it initially and wept bitterly over the loss of my possessions, my lifestyle, my brothers, my home. I now work as a baker, living a much simpler, but more satisfying life, and I am raising a daughter. I stay away from nightlife, which is incompatible with my work hours, and trying to be a responsible parent. I don't drink or smoke anymore. I am friendly with the people I work with and with customers, but I never talk about myself, preferring instead to ask them questions about themselves. People will tell you anything if you show interest when they talk about themselves, which was one of the key tools I learned back in my past life. So far, no repercussions from my past as far as I can tell, which is more than what I deserve if I'm being honest. I imagine someday everything will catch up with me, but I want to shield my daughter from all of that as much as I can. I want her memories of me to be favorable. I want her to believe that I am a boring person who has banal routines and simple pleasures. Story 10. I used to chill with Redacted, very renowned US gang, who grew up together because they were nice guys to me and they had great drug prices. Plus, who doesn't want real, 30-plus-year-old gang members to have your back when you're a friendless minority? I'm white, going to an extremely low-income high school. I remember coming home, and homie being in my house doing nothing except scraping his grinder with a pocket knife. He also had his pistol on the table. That's pretty obnoxious even today. Like, bruh, I know you're a shooter. You don't gotta flex on me like that. I can still hear him today. Bet you didn't expect to come home and see that motions to gun. Did you? Bruh, I totally expect that at this point. And this guy, gangster one, would always get pissed drunk and tell me that I don't know shit about life or God, while also crying to me about people he's killed. I try to empathize, but this becomes a chore when you hear it several times per month. Gangster 2 was the pusher. Most quality stuff in town. These guys would hang out together since childhood. So I would go over to number 2's house, who's also 30 plus and has been in the game 20 plus, and just get amazing drags while listening to them tell me who they pulled up on. Kids walking around in blue in their neighborhood, so he warns them with strong words. He sees them in a bigger group a couple minutes later, and pulls his AK on them and tells them they need to leave now. Anyways, this was all great fun for me as a kid/young adult. But then there was this fight, and my brother was involved. He was hanging out with them, and a bar fight, then a shootout broke out. My brother tells me he fought, but the gang members later came over to the house and chided him for disappearing during the fight. There were people shot, and Gangster 1 and 2 hopped in their cars and continued the shootout with the other gang while they were driving. Anyways, it was then that I realized that my brother shouldn't have to apologize for running from that situation, which I believe he did. So it was kind of then that I realized that I could get pulled up on if I was hanging out with these guys. I broke ties. They weren't extremely happy. They frequently knocked on my door and talked to me about how what I'm doing isn't cool. But they never assaulted or threatened me, so I really believe that they were literally being as nice as they possibly could. Anyways, I stopped talking to them about 5 or 6 years ago when I moved to another town. Sometimes I talk to them on Facebook though. Some of the friends I made though them ended up being hurt or worse by rival gangs, not because of me. It's really hard, man. It really makes me see how pointless shooting, and really violence in general, is. Oh yeah, I also got a shotgun pulled on me. Like, the dude cocked it and aimed right at me. In public. And the cops never showed up after they were called. So that wasn't awesome. Anyways, I might have put too much info on here, so I don't know if I'll keep this up. Let me just say to you youngins, it's really not worth it to bang. Like, at all. You can make like a few $100 extra per week, but you can also just get shot for some dumbass reason. Story 11. I was in one of the largest and most feared Mexican gangs in Los Angeles. But the crazy thing was that no one outside of my close friends and cousins knew. To the outside world, I was a baby-faced kid with a comb over that was enrolled in honors classes his entire life. What made me leave was the fact that I lived by own code. I did not jump people, I didn't tag, and I didn't steal. And a lot of other members did not like that. My cousins and uncles were shot callers, so I was somewhat safe. But I quickly found myself living over my shoulder. When you are in a gang, you are paranoid as ever. I was originally recruited for my brain and muscle. These, however, ultimately pulled me away from the gang life. I ended up getting accepted to colleges and took up boxing and MMA. The final push was when I became a Christian my senior year of high school. Now I am currently double majoring in theological studies and computer science. As for my past coming back to haunt me, I did see a ghost the other day. I was on my way to work at 4 a.m., and I had a skateboard rolling behind me. And I noticed its speed was irregular. You learn this after years of paranoia. I clenched my fist ready for some fool to try to mug me. But then I heard someone say my name. It was my best friend from high school. His family was from MS-13, a notorious Salvadorian gang. I say I saw a ghost because he was a shell of what he used to be. He ended up getting high on his own supply, being kicked out of his house and beaten out of the gang for stealing. His dad was a shot caller. He would have been killed if not for that. That's my story and the story of so many poor first-generation Latino Americans from the hood. Story 12. Probably too late for this one, but I have countless stories of gang life pre-2014. I got into drugs at an early age, not using them, just exchanging them for chump change, violence, and just fighting in general. I was a young white boy going to an 80% black high school in 2007, where you couldn't walk around with your tail between your legs, or you would be chewed up and spit out. Multiple white students suffered serious injuries due to violence. I only chose that life through circumstance to survive, and I ultimately dropped out, then relocated to finish high school anyway. I lead a different life back then, and most people, except for close family and my first girlfriend and a few roommates I had at the time, didn't understand what extracurricular activities I was doing. I could go on with some personal entertaining anecdotes, but what got me out of it was shifting my perspective toward relationships. I stopped attributing the idea of success to financial development and independence. I started valuing my relationships with people more than anything, and though I am still entirely fascinated by microeconomies and people systems, playing poker has been a good way to get my kicks without endangering myself. I moved around a lot, every few months, staying with someone else. I've been robbed, shot at people, had a gun in my mouth, hit in the back of the head with my own skateboard by a dude I thought I was tight with. The worst was one time I had a close friend who was going to score some X for 10 a pill, and in my city that goes minimum 20 a pill to everyone between the poorest and wealthiest demographic. Most of the gang activity was through the hardcore music scene, and most of my clients were various band members from all over the country, not high profile or anything, just like local bands who scrape by to travel and have a good time and share their rubbish music. The other target demographic was skaters. Anyway, I gave her a little over $5K, most money I ever had in my life, and a 100% risk-reward scenario. I was terrible with bankroll management, and told her keep the change, but get me whatever that can get me at bulk, because she had the connection, and business as per usual. She went to meet her connect while I waited in her living room at 2 in the morning with forgetto-looking black dudes, all with guns. More scared than I'd ever been otherwise in my entire life, knowing the multiple scenarios where I might not be alive an hour from then. Be the SJW you want to be. Race was and still is highly relevant on the streets. I say they were black because they were black and I was as white as a ghost, still am. Race was relevant. I never hurt anyone who I didn't justify and rationalize through my own internal honor system was worthy of hurt. I never messed with innocent people. Most people who approached me over the years I would feign ignorance because I didn't really nickel and dime, and I'd try to find out through the grapevine who referred them to me, so I would never do business with them again. I never did drugs at all. I may have hotboxed quite a few times, but the first time I ever smoked was after this phase of my life, and I met my ex-girlfriend of a little over 2 years that same night through a then mutual friend, who now is one of my best friends. At one point my ex and I wanted to experiment with a pretty common plant, and I realized at that moment, about a year after I got out of that life, I had no idea where to get it. I was happy in that moment. My ex ended up knowing a guy who had fire for roughly $250 and oh, which is pretty standard around here for buying in small amounts like that, but you can easily push 180 and oh once you approach a pound, so it worked out. Now I investigate fraud for a living, was hired a little over 8 months ago, and have been promoted twice since then, but that's its own story. My past never came back to haunt me, in a serious manner that negatively impacted my life. I had no phone number from back in the day, deleted and started over all social media, moved in with my mom, started going to college, and focused on my new relationship with my recent ex. But occasionally I'd see an other message or a sketchy friend request, but I'd pay no mind to it. In a very small way though it took a toll, because I met a lot of highly attractive people in the hardcore scene through those connections, and my ex expressed indirectly consistently, and directly 3 times throughout our relationship, that she was uncomfortable with me being friends with so many hot chicks, and I could never tell her the truth about how I met them. She'd see me scrolling through FB, and there'd be this girl posing, and my ex would be like, "LOL, how do you even know here?" and keep prying until I had to provide some sort of unsatisfactory answer. Toward the end of our relationship, to my understanding, she actually started adding many of these people to her own social media for whatever reason. It's not like it is in the movies. That's the first thing. There isn't much action. That happens on more of a frontline nickel and dime level. The people you have working streets for you assume more risk in that respect. Everyone is scared. That's easy to pick up on, and you can use it. You can turn your suppliers into clients by going to them with larger amounts and asking to meet their guy. If they're sketchy about it, that's a good indicator not to deal with them anymore. On a related note, informants were everywhere and easy to spot, but only after you'd already done business with them a few times. Simple things like catch/release records, claims of a trust fund, a lifestyle that doesn't support their legitimate income. I am 100% certain the DEA knows exactly what I was up to, but never had anything to gain by arresting me. On a certain scale, drags can't exist without being noticed. That just isn't possible. People like Gus in Breaking Bad can't go under the radar. That's what makes that show unrealistic. All it takes is balls. You have to be smart and know how to hustle and have a poker face. If people know you're scared, you're not gaining their respect, and you're not progressing. Realistically, people only call your bluff 1% of the time. Just made that up, probably higher. What matters is that you act confident and fake it until you make it. At the end of the day, I got into it for the wrong reasons. My dad went to prison for selling drugs, and I learned a lot from what he did wrong, and from his countless stories from over the years and various discussions we've had. I didn't want to end up like him. He's out now but has nothing, and is going on 45 starting over. It's the most discouraging and disheartening thing. I got out of it because I felt like I didn't need to. I started a card shop with some friends, worked there a few years, met a lot of really cool people along the way as I was transitioning away, and was content working 20 hours a week making minimum wage, sometimes even 80+ hours because I got to make my own hours and loved what I did. Half the people I worked with were previous clients, and not one person ever mentioned anything because they understood. The transitional phase was the hardest. You can't just get out one day. That's a death wish. You have to connect everyone and find a new middleman or rearrange once you're at a certain point. Yeah, if you just deal with a few OS at a time or something, it's no big. No one will care or notice. But when you have a schedule and meet with people who make more money in a week than you do in a year, you have to find a way to connect them while minimizing risk for everyone involved. That's the hardest part of getting out. For the next year after I was out, I was afraid every day either the DEA or worse would come right through my mom's front door, and my life would be over in one way or another. I had cameras and an alarm for that day. So hopefully I've illustrated the point here that not every former gang member was a pistol-slinging drug addict. Most of the people on a larger scale are normal people just like you. All they want is to have fun, but without the risk assumed in facilitating the fun themselves. That's why middlemen exist, and where the finder's fee comes into play. I don't really regret anything. I don't even think about it most days actually, usually only at night when I can't sleep, or when I see that kind of stuff in movies/TV. But yes, in ways for about a year after it came back to haunt me every day, but never in a serious or dramatic way, mostly just paranoia. Story 13. Prison sucks, and I knocked up a friendly girl, so it was starting to seem like a dumb life plan. That's why I stopped. I wasn't actually a patched member though, more what you could call a sympathizer/employee. The worst way it ever came back to haunt me was bumping into an old work colleague in the streets 15 years later, when I was walking with my daughter. "Steve, yo man, you got any PCP by any chance?" "Dude, seriously, it's been 15 years, and I'm pushing a goddamn stroller." "No, I don't. Go away, dumbass." "Jesus Christ, I guess you haven't changed. I would have thought that 8-year stretch you did might have taught you something, but I guess not. Bye." And that was that. Also the occasional cop that thinks he's clever. "Oh, I see here that you were arrested for trafficking in 1994. Dude, you weren't even out of your dad's bag in 1994. I've been clean for longer than you've been a cop. Shut up and leave me alone." "Oh, but you see, the fact that you've never applied for a pardon and have a clean record since just tells us you got smarter at the drug game. No, pardons are just super expensive, and I've never felt the need to get one. That life is so far behind me that I honestly just forgot." Story 14. This is not me, but I did an outward bound for rehabilitation and was interesting mix of people. We didn't have enough in our excursion, so we combined courses. So everyone in my original group had chosen to go and paid out of pocket for it. They are very expensive, and mine cost about $16,000 for an 1-month excursion into the Everglades of Florida. The group we were mixed with were all court mandated, and it was that or jail. I met a friend on that journey who was court mandated and from the south side of Chicago. It really made me rethink my problems and grow as a person. He had joined a gang at 8 years old because his best friend was killed while walking home for school. By 11 he was an enforcer. He beat the younger kids than him and had to any girl that wanted to join. At 13 he was made to become a dealer and started selling heroin. He knows of 3 people who OD'd off his supply. Not to mention his parents were in the rival gang of his. He'd come home and get beat by his family because he didn't join that gang. Later that year he was shot walking home from a deal. The bullet went through, but left a weird-looking scar on his stomach. His parents kicked him out, and he lived in I think a halfway house for the next few years. He was caught stealing food, and then beat the shit out of the store clerk, which is how he ended up with his court-mandated order. Now the reason I bring this up, and him and I became close. He was afraid to leave because the rules of his gang were make it to 35 and retire or die, or become a servant of God. Now if you choose God they would have someone follow you, and if you didn't have a Bible on you 24/7 they would kill you. A 16-year-old was dealing with this. Commit to this life or die were the only options he saw. I think Outward Bound saved his life. The 4 of us who decided to do Outward Bound decided that we would talk to our parents as soon as it was over and try and get some money together to help him escape Chicago. My parents gave this kid they had never met $1,000 based on the fact that I promised I would do anything they wanted if they would help my friend in need. I forget the total we gave him, but it was somewhere around $3,500. When he got back to Chicago, he spent one day seeing all his friends and then bought a train ticket to Missouri. He used the money to get pharmacy training and now works as a pharmacy tech, making more money than I do. 3 years later, he has a girlfriend and his own house. We don't talk that much anymore, but we have a lifelong bond after that month together. For the rest of his life, he has to look over his shoulders because he has been marked for death. He can never go back to where he was born or see his friends again. For me personally, it was hard to grasp that kind of life. My school had 2 black people in the entire school from K to 12. I wish I could help more people that are stuck in a life like that. I'm sorry for this rant. I haven't really ever told this story before except to very close friends. I know Ollie uses Reddit, so maybe he'll see this. You know, it's me, as there aren't very many people allergic to the cold. Story 15. This will probably get buried, but here goes. During high school, I was best friends with this guy Mike. Mike was a really mouthy kid though, and would run his mouth to a group of kids that lived in the co-op across the street from our bus stop. Running his mouth turned into a couple small fights, mostly the kind of high school fights where everyone stands around mouthing off but not actually throwing punches. Some days, the co-op kids would be waiting for Mike to get off the bus, so every afternoon when the bus dropped us off, we would check to see if these kids were there waiting. If they were, then a group of us would all get off the bus because we wanted to have his back and make sure that he didn't get jumped. This went on for a pretty long time before some of the co-op kids started bringing baseball bats and threatening us with them. I think they were just trying to look tough, and I'm not sure that they would have actually done anything, since most of the fighting up to that point was really just standing around and swearing at each other. But when Mike's older cousin, who was in his 20s, heard about the baseball bats, he went ballistic and showed up the next day with a bat of his own, and beat one of the co-op kids so badly that the guy was hospitalized with 2 black eyes, a broken nose, and some broken ribs. That was the tipping point right there. Now these co-op kids started getting their older brothers and cousins involved too. About a week later, Mike got jumped and beaten by a couple guys with bats and steel-toed shoes, and spent a couple days in the hospital. Mike's cousin got a couple of his older friends involved, and, before we knew it, people were getting jumped and getting the shit kicked out of them on both sides. We didn't go anywhere alone anymore, and usually brought a group of friends and some of the older guys with us. Anytime someone from our group was attacked, our older guys would retaliate, which would cause the other side to retaliate. It was just a circle. It didn't feel like I was in a gang at the time. It just felt like we had a group of older guys protecting us, but looking back, I would definitely now say that it was a gang. The problem was that you couldn't just get out if you wanted to. If I had cut off ties with my group and the older guys, I would have had nobody to protect me, and I would have got the shit kicked out of me by the co-op kids. Thankfully, I got into college and left town. During my first year of college, my family moved, so I didn't have to go back and deal with the gang BS anymore. In the couple years after I left, I heard that things had really escalated. One of the co-op kids was stabbed and killed, and one of the older guys on our side was beaten into a coma and died. Mike and his cousin started dealing weed by the pound, and his cousin was eventually busted and took the fall for that and went to jail. I don't think anyone in my group considered it to be a gang, even though it was, so they were all understanding when I left for college and when my family moved. I don't keep in touch with any of them except for Mike, and even then it's just an occasional Facebook message to see how he's doing. That was all about 7 to 8 years ago, and my past hasn't come back to haunt me, although I'm still very weary that I'll run into a couple of the co-op kids someday, and they'll still have a grudge against me. Story 16. I used to be a tag banger as a teenager. Think graffiti crew on the verge of being recognized as a street gang due to its acts of violence and size. It was about 25 of us in a 4-block radius with a heavy presence in a half-mile stretch of a main avenue. The night of August 22nd, 2003, I was in my room reading Luis Rodriguez's Always Running. I heard gunshots a few blocks from my place. Thinking nothing of it, I kept reading. The next morning I found out it was an 18-year-old named O, a close friend of mine. He was a member of a gang called 18th Street. He was caught leaving his pregnant girlfriend's house by 4 enemy gang members. He was chased down and shot point blank 5 times. I, along with 3 other shot callers from my crew, attended his funeral and burial. After the burial, we were approached by an 18er rep. He told us to show up to a party that night in O's honor. That night at the party, we were taken to the back of the house where there was a meeting happening. My friend's older brothers were big time in the gang, one of them calling shots from prison, and the latter wanted blood. The way they saw it, O was killed in our neighborhood, and as his friends we had to get back at his murderers. We were given an ultimatum, align with 18th Street, drop our graffiti crew, and take care of any enemy members in our territory. In return they would provide guns, drugs, and the right to start our own chapter of the gang. If we refused, we should either disband or consider ourselves in their crosshairs. As silly as it all sounds, you'd be surprised how structured and diplomatic street gangs really are. So we gathered up all the guys and talked about it. We were pretty much split. I mentioned the book Always Running, because it showed me to consider the fact that the world is bigger than a couple city blocks. And O's death made me question if dying for a few numbers and letters was worth it. I also had a girlfriend who I wanted to marry, not then at 18 but later down the line. I left it all that night. More than half the guys took up 18th Street's offer. Me and the rest were shunned. The following 2 months saw a surge of violence which capped off with 2 dumped bodies in the middle of a field. The police cracked down hard soon after. I moved out of the neighborhood. Years later I married my girlfriend. We had a son. I worked hard while she finished her university studies. My dad still lives in that neighborhood. It is now an 18th Street bastion. I run into some of the guys when I visit Dad. Most are in prison, dead, or strung out on drugs. The younger kids are the ones running the streets now. It's a never-ending cycle.